Let's continue the discussion of the fundamentals of pistol marksmanship with now jumping into trigger control. We're going to break this down into 3 subtopics of how do we place our finger on the trigger so that we maximize the leverage against the trigger while minimizing any lateral influences that could throw the shots off. How do we apply that pressure to the trigger, again with the end state of not deviating the sights, and then we'll close things out with some training tips so that you can fully integrate trigger control with the other fundamentals. First, we'll discuss trigger finger placement. If we recall from the grip video, at rest, our trigger finger should be high indexed onto the frame of the gun, well away from the trigger guard and away from the trigger. When the trigger finger is high indexed like this, note that the base segment of the trigger finger is going to be generally parallel with the center line or the frame of the gun. When we're ready to take the shot, we're merely going to let the finger slide down to make contact with the front of the trigger. Note that when the finger makes contact with the front of the trigger, the base segment of the trigger finger is still generally parallel with the frame or the side of the gun. We are pivoting at the second joint of the trigger finger and only placing about the first third of the tip of the finger onto the trigger. These 2 factors combined also tend to create a little air gap between the base segment of the trigger finger and the frame of the gun, which helps to minimize that lateral influence that you may have absent that air gap. If the base segment is pressing up against the frame of the gun and you're activating the trigger, there tends to be a bit of a lateral sideways influence. So by maintaining the base segment of the trigger finger parallel to the frame, maintaining that air gap, minimizing how much finger is on the trigger, and pivoting at the second knuckle, we tend to ensure that that direction of force is straight to the rear as we activate the trigger. The amount of trigger finger that you put through the trigger guard and where you make contact with the trigger is largely going to be dependent on the size of your hands in relation to the size of the grip of the gun. For most people, a good start point is to use just that first third of the tip of the finger to make contact with the front of the trigger. If you have large hands or long fingers and a smaller frame gun, then of course you may end up with more trigger finger going through the trigger guard than this. But for most people, the ideal or the optimal depth is only the first third of the tip of the trigger finger. So that's how much finger we put on the trigger horizontally, as in how deep through the trigger guard do we go. Now let's talk about vertical placement. I generally recommend for most people to go as low on the trigger as possible because this will give you, the shooter, the maximum amount of leverage. By having extra leverage on the trigger, it's going to feel as if it requires fewer pounds of pressure to activate the trigger. This will be more beneficial for guns that have a longer trigger, and you can think of longer trigger here in both the context of the height of the trigger. The further away you get from the pivot point, then of course the more leverage you're going to have mechanically, but also the longer the length of pull of your trigger. And this will be especially helpful for those guns that are double action / single action, meaning that that initial shot from the holster will be in double action before subsequent shots being in single action. That initial trigger squeeze is going to require a greater length of pull as well as greater pounds of pressure to activate the trigger. So the lower you go on the face of the trigger, the better leverage. Less pressure on the trigger equals less opportunity for you to influence sideways wonky pressures to disturb the sights. Now let's tie the concepts of trigger finger placement with trigger finger pressures. To recap, we're going to maintain the base segment of the trigger finger generally parallel with the frame. We're going to pivot at the second joint and only put about the first third or so of the pad of the trigger finger onto the front of the trigger. In similar fashion to our discussion on grip pressures, where the middle and ring finger are going to be putting pressure through the front strap, through the grip, to keep the gun cemented firmly into the web of the hand. As we apply that pressure to the front of the trigger, we're also going to be maintaining that pressure directly to the rear or in line with the axis of the gun. Another way of saying this, conceptualize that as you are applying pressure to the front of the trigger, that pressure is going through the gun into the web of the hand. If you apply any lateral pressures as you are finishing off the trigger squeeze, then you're going to deviate the sight alignment in that direction. If you have too little finger on the trigger, then what we tend to see, the general observation, is that we're pulling the gun to the 3 o'clock if you're a right-handed shooter. So if you're grouping a little bit to the right, and it's not a sight alignment issue and it's not a grip pressure issue, look at your trigger finger placement. Generally, I don't see that as an issue. For most people, they're putting too much finger onto the trigger. If we put too much finger onto the trigger, and especially if we reduce or eliminate that air gap that we are trying to maintain, then what tends to happen is instead of pulling the gun to the right, then we tend to push the gun to the support side, or for a right-handed shooter to the 9 o'clock. This isn't to say you can't shoot effectively if your hands are too big or too small and you can't get what I'm describing as that optimal trigger finger placement. You just have to be very deliberate that as you're applying that pressure to the trigger, it's going directly to the rear and you're not putting any lateral influence on the gun. As we're applying that pressure directly from the front to the rear, visualize that you're pulling the trigger through the axis of the gun, the pressure going again to the web of the hand. This pressure on the face of the trigger needs to be smooth and consistent. By smooth, what I mean is we're avoiding any snappiness as we're finishing off the pressure on the trigger. There's a tendency that as soon as the sights are aligned exactly how we want them, we want to snap that shot really fast. And in doing so, we're exerting wonky pressures that are going to misalign the sights. To use the camera analogy, it's like you took all this time to get the subject perfectly framed and in focus, and at the last minute, instead of smoothly pressing the button on the camera, you smash it really hard and it just throws everything out of whack. We've taken the time for all the preceding fundamentals. I want you to be nice and smooth on the trigger. I also don't want you to milk the trigger, meaning do not squeeze a little bit, let off, squeeze a little bit more, let off, and then incrementally take it in small steps. The milking the trigger problem is typically associated with a double action type trigger to where you have a very long and stiff initial trigger squeeze. Once you apply pressure to the trigger, you're ready to take that shot, you're committed. Smoothly, with one fluid motion, bring the trigger to the rear until the round breaks. So that covers trigger finger placement and trigger finger pressures. Now let's pivot into some training methods so that we can fully integrate trigger control with the remaining fundamentals with an eye on eventually having rapid fire strings where our trigger control is not throwing or deviating the sights as part of that rapid fire process. Referring back to an earlier discussion, we never ever touch the trigger at position 1, 2, or 3 of the draw stroke. Once we have left position 3 and we are en route to position 4, then I encourage you to go ahead and touch the trigger, take up the slack. We are prepping the trigger en route, holding it at the wall, confirming the sights, and then within that 2 or 3 seconds of our natural respiratory pause, smoothly finishing off the pressure on the trigger. Now the term holding it at the wall, this refers to take up all the slack that's in the trigger and hold it at that last point to where if we apply just a little bit more pressure, it's going to activate the trigger, breaking the shot. The amount of slack that needs to be taken up is going to vary from gun to gun. Some guns have a bit more slack, some have very little. So initially using dry fire will help to identify how much slack you have, where that wall is. To find where that wall is on your trigger, we're going to take the cleared gun, keep it pointed in a safe direction, apply pressure on the trigger directly to the rear, and where you feel that resistance to where if you apply just a little bit more pressure, the round is going to break, that is where your wall is at. This is going to vary from gun to gun, so if you change from one make and model to another, you're going to need to repeat the process so you can refine where that wall is at. So what we're doing here is effectively integrating aiming, breath control, and trigger squeeze all into one fluid motion. As we're pressing from position 3 out to 4, we're touching and prepping the trigger, holding it at the wall. Once we get our sights aligned and we're hyper-focused either on the front sight or if we're using a dot, we're still focused at the focal length of the target and making sure the dot is where we want it. And then once the sights are confirmed, we're smoothly applying the rest of the pressure to the trigger until the shot breaks. I initially asked my students to keep the trigger pinned to the rear after the shot breaks so that we can perform a type of isolation drill where we focus on trigger reset. This is not the end state. Depending on how fast you're shooting, your trigger reset needs to be fluid and uber fast and smooth. This is a building block to get us to that state. When the shot breaks, the gun is going to cycle on its own, effectively loading the next live round into the chamber while simultaneously resetting the firing mechanism. All you have to do is let off the pressure on the trigger just to the point to where you hear or feel that click. That's as far as you need to release the trigger. By maintaining that trigger finger contact with the trigger, meaning I don't want to see an air gap emerging between the trigger and the trigger finger during the reset, you're building that neural pathway so you understand you only have to release the trigger so far before you're able to take that next shot. Also don't want you to fling the finger off the trigger as part of that trigger reset. We have adduction muscles and abduction muscles. The adduction muscles are the ones that contract to bring things closer to the body. The abduction muscles are the ones that fling or push things away from the body. We're only using our adduction muscles. We're compressing the trigger finger to apply the pressure to the trigger. Once the round goes off, we're pinning it to the rear and just relaxing those adduction muscles to the point to where that little baby spring within the trigger mechanism is pushing the finger forward just to the trigger reset. The bullet leaves the muzzle within milliseconds, but what you may observe is if you're flinging the finger off the trigger as part of your shot process, then your rounds may be impacting slightly to the strong side of the gun. Meaning as a right-handed shooter, your shots may be impacting to the 3 o'clock. So maintain contact with the trigger. Initially practice that very deliberate trigger reset. We're pinning the trigger to the rear, doing our follow through, and as part of that follow through we'll talk about in the next video, we're only relaxing the trigger finger just to the point of that trigger reset, and we're ready to take that next shot if necessary. If we're taking another shot within that string, we already have the trigger at the wall. We're just confirming our sights, momentarily stopping our breath cycle, applying that pressure, taking the shot, being very deliberate on the reset, and then continuing as such. Once you're done shooting, and that is your last shot, we'll practice that trigger reset, and then we will extend the finger, removing it from the trigger guard and replacing it with that high index onto the frame. Now, I want to reinforce that what I just described is an isolation type drill. The end state is not that we are always pinning the trigger to the rear. This is just a methodology so that you understand how little motion it takes on the trigger. The end state we're driving for is to be able to run the trigger efficiently. You can go really, really fast with this once you get the muscle memory or that neural conditioning, the myelination, however you refer to it. Once that is established, you'll be able to run that trigger really efficiently, which equates to running it really fast without causing deviation to the sight alignment. Depending on the speed and accuracy you need for whatever the task is at hand, you can throttle up or throttle back the work on the trigger to achieve the balance of the speed and the accuracy that you're needing at that point in time. If you have any questions or comments on any of this, make sure you throw it in that discussion below. If you're finding value in this, make sure you are subscribed. Don't stop there. Hit the notification bell and select all to make sure that YouTube is actually pushing out these updates to you. I'd also ask you to hit that share button and push this out to others in your community. Get the word out on how to apply these fundamentals properly. Even better, navigate to the description, copy the playlist link, and send that out to your peer group. If you're looking for other ways of supporting the channel, then you can consider hitting that join button down there. It'll help financially to support the things we're doing on this channel. All right, that's enough pandering on my part. Check out over here as we jump into the final fundamental of follow through and see how we incorporate all of these fundamentals together before, during, and after the shot. All right, until next time, God bless you and stay safe.